Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni Viewer, and with Avengers Infinity War looming large on the horizon, I think now is the best possible time to rank all of the MCU movies which have led up to it. Which entries are the worst and which are the best? That's what I'm here to determine today. Now bear in mind, this is just how I rank them, and I already know some of these choices go against those of the majority. So if you disagree, well then you disagree, but it's my list. Also, for the sake of maintaining focus, I'm sticking exclusively with the theatrical movies here, so the TV shows and Netflix series aren't on the list. Maybe I'll rank them on their own list another day. For now though, let's go through the Marvel Cinematic Universe from worst to best, starting with Outlier, Black Panther. When I first left the theater after seeing Black Panther, I made a review that called the overall experience positive. The more time passes though, the more I wonder if I was holding back on certain things to avoid perpetuating the negative atmosphere clinging to this movie like the residue of mustard gas. I've only seen the movie once at this point, so I don't know if my growing uncertainty is simply my own perceptions naturally altering over time, or the result of being inundated with think pieces from both the left and the right dissecting its cultural relevancy. Until I see it again, I have to consider Black Panther an outlier on the list. Number 17, The Incredible Hulk. In the greater MCU, the Incredible Hulk sticks out like the sore green thumb of a rage giant. On the one hand, its darker tone stands in sharp contrast to the other films, making it feel like the last dying breath of Marvel's super serious phase. On the other hand, a miscalculation on Marvel's part caused the movie to be packed with sequel hooks which, to date, have yet to be realized. On the other hand, Edward Norton didn't reprise the role, so that was pointless. On the other hand, the Avengers does a fine job of reintroducing the Hulk on its own, meaning you don't really need to watch this one. Can't get much worse than a chapter you can skip without missing anything, hence why the Incredible Hulk sits squarely at the bottom. Number 16, Iron Man 3. If I ran a more politically focused channel, Iron Man 3 might have landed on the bottom beneath the Incredible Hulk. Despite initially enjoying it, one thing has become impossible to deny. This thing is 9/11 truther propaganda. For no discernible reason, Marvel and Shane Black thought it was okay to continue pushing the idea that the 9/11 attacks were an inside job, despite the lack of any hard evidence to support the idea. You really think they changed the Mandarin to avoid negative stereotypes? Yeah, right. They changed him to fit this narrative which no rational person takes seriously, which is the same reason they depicted wounded veterans as the villains. Heck, Iron Man 3 is the only movie Marvel made a point of apologizing for with the short film Hail to the King. It still has its good moments, but I can't ignore these issues which bog it down. It sits above Incredible Hulk, but only just. Number 15, Thor. The best term I can use to describe the God of Thunder's first theatrical outing is overly cautious. Thor is a movie that wants to do something bold, but is too afraid to do it, so instead does something safe. Marvel hired Kenneth Branagh to direct, then put him in a crate and told him to stay inside it. The movie is ripe for high fantasy, yet does everything it can to convince us it's actually plausible science fiction. It gives us an amazing new setting with Asgard, but spends most of its time in the New Mexico desert. We have a host of interesting characters from another realm of magic and monsters, and they are kept to the sidelines so we can follow human characters who are less interesting at best and annoying at worst. Oh, and don't get me started on how pointless Hawkeye's cameo is. The result is a movie that I want to like more than I do. Thor could have been the real standout of Phase 1 if Marvel had just allowed it to be more mythic. Number 14, Iron Man 2. I personally think Iron Man 2 gets too much of a bad rap. There's a lot of stuff that serves as logical extensions of plot threads from the first movie, the introduction of War Machine works incredibly well, and it does a much better job of incorporating a future Avenger into the proceedings than Thor does. That being said, I cannot deny that this movie is less of a second Iron Man movie and more of a prequel to the Avengers, yet another example of how unsure Marvel was in those early days. I certainly enjoy watching it more than the movies which rank beneath it, but that doesn't mean I can rank it very high. Number 13, Thor: The Dark World. Yes, I am of the unpopular opinion that Thor the Dark World is better than the first movie, and not without reason. The Dark World is where the focus shifted more towards Thor's side of the universe, giving us a story with a more cosmic scope, with the benefits of making Asgard feel more like a real place than last time. The best part of this shift was allowing us to better explore the relationship between Thor and Loki, which has always been one of the best dynamics in the whole MCU. Even with those great elements though, a lot of the issues from the first movie still carry over into this one, now with the added problem of an underdeveloped villain in Malekith. Those knock it down the ranks, but improvement is improvement, and Thor the Dark World is definitely an improvement over the Thunder God's first outing. Number 12. Spider-Man Homecoming. Lots of people have been calling Spider-Man Homecoming the best Spider-Man movie ever. I am not one of them. I don't hate it, but I certainly don't think it's the greatest movie to feature old Webhead. 4 things are holding it back for me. First, there's Zendaya's character, an annoying pretentious teen who serves absolutely no purpose other than to be the alternative MJ, which the studio immediately backpedaled on, so that was pointless. Second, it follows essentially the same plot as the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, so it doesn't really do anything especially new. Third, and in a similar vein, it lacks the style of Raimi's movies, making it indistinguishable visually and tonally from every other film. Fourth and last, it doesn't really allow Spidey to stand on his own. At every turn, we are reminded that Spider-Man Homecoming is part of the MCU, resulting in it feeling less like a standalone introduction and more like a sequel. Which it kind of is anyway. That being said, it still has good stuff. The expressive mask looks great, Michael Keaton was amazing as the Vulture, and the dynamic between Peter Parker and Tony Stark works very well. It's not a bad movie by any stretch, but the greatest Spider-Man movie ever? I just can't agree. Number 11. Ant-Man. Though I was at first underwhelmed after my initial viewing, this movie about a shrinking hero has grown on me, pun intended. The way in which Ant-Man was able to show that superheroes could embrace multiple genres by being more of a heist movie than an action movie was a good call. The ways in which the movie plays with the concept of being able to shrink makes for some wonderful moments, and the dynamic between the 3 leads was surprisingly entertaining. Yet there are still things holding it back. The villain is basically Lex Luthor, who seems to have wandered onto the set while trying to get to the Warner Brothers lot, and the CGI ants don't always look that good. The real elephant in the room is what happened behind the scenes. The fact that Edgar Wright and the Marvel execs couldn't see eye to eye is unfortunate for many reasons, and though it did finally teach Marvel its lesson about working with the directors it hires rather than placing restrictions on them, one can only wonder what might have been had the 2 parties found a compromise. Still, Ant-Man is good. Number 10. Captain America Civil War. There is a lot, and I mean a lot, about Captain America Civil War that works. The conflict that splits Steve Rogers and Tony Stark is a fascinating one with implications that are interesting to contemplate. The character-driven action scenes are loads of fun to watch, and the way in which the story takes plot points from previous movies and builds on them in ways that feel as though they were planned from the start is nothing short of impressive. There are, however, 2 things holding it back, and they are rather significant. First is the lack of stakes. For a movie with war in the title, there's not much of a body count among the major players. Somebody had to die to really drive home the tragedy of the scenario, and the one time it seems that someone might, we get a cop-out instead. Second is the lack of decisiveness. The movie never quite settles on which side is right, which could have worked if the audience was supposed to decide for itself, but it really just feels like a lack of desire to commit. Despite that, however, the movie is still a darn good outing. Number 9. Avengers Age of Ultron. If one thing is holding Avengers Age of Ultron back from greatness, it would be the fact that it knows the sequels are coming. As such, it throws in a lot of setup, from the introduction of Ulysses Klaue to Thor's visions of Ragnarok. Aside from that, though, Age of Ultron gives us a great crossover with a great villain in the form of the eponymous robot. Despite being vastly different from his portrayal in the comics, Ultron makes for an excellent villain to oppose the Avengers, which is important since good villains are something the MCU has always struggled with. It doesn't quite reach the same iconic status of the first crossover, but it's still loads of fun on its own. Number 8. Doctor Strange. Let's get the major flaw out of the way first. Plot-wise, Doctor Strange is just close enough to the plot of the first Iron Man to be noticeable. That being said, what the movie manages to do with that skeleton of a concept makes for a great movie. Stephen Strange is a fascinating character to follow and see this new world of magic through, and the lengths to which the movie goes to make everything as otherworldly as possible does a lot to set this movie apart. Honestly, this willingness to embrace fantasy should have been present back in the first Thor movie. The best aspect, though, has to be the way in which the movie ends, which is the first superhero movie I can remember seeing in a long time where the hero relies entirely on his wits rather than his fists to defeat the villain. As a result, Doctor Strange ranks pretty high on the current list. Number 7. Captain America: The First Avenger. I'm a sucker for period pieces and pulp heroics, and Captain America: The First Avenger embraces both. Despite feeling as though it rushed through the better part of World War II, it still provided a great origin for Captain America, great visuals based on actual plans for wartime vehicles that were never built, and a fun romp that stands out in the greater MCU even today. Unfortunately, it also suffers from the sequel setup that plagues the majority of Phase 1 movies, but thanks to the time period, it doesn't feel especially invasive, and even manages to work itself in naturally to the proceedings. It may not be the best Cap movie, but it is close. Number 6. Thor Ragnarok. It took 3 movies, but the Thor franchise was finally allowed to embrace its fantastical side with Thor Ragnarok. Thanks in large part to Taika Waititi being allowed to add his own quirky sensibilities to the film, Ragnarok finally felt like the Thor movie we should have gotten from the start. Something that just embraces the cosmic fantasy of the Marvel Universe and lets the Norse gods be the mythic entities they're supposed to be. Yes, it has probably precluded a live-action Planet Hulk movie, but I don't care. We still have an animated one that's pretty good, so go watch that. If you want a great Thor movie, though, Thor Ragnarok is just what the doctor ordered. Number 5. Captain America: The Winter Soldier. There's just no denying that Captain America: The Winter Soldier is a darn good political thriller. It's got well-executed twists and turns, near-perfect action, and a great emotional core that keeps us invested the whole way through. Despite having a similar lack of stakes to Civil War and a similar penchant for sequel baiting as Age of Ultron, those elements are not as obvious here, and actually do a better job of serving the story. Most people rank it as number 1, but I've got a few others which I think are better. Still, I cannot deny how great The Winter Soldier is. Number 4. The Avengers. There's just no getting around the fact that this movie is iconic. The Avengers features a weird sort of meta-commentary about its very existence. Remember, there were lots of people who thought this movie wouldn't work, so the movie applies that question to its own plot about bringing these various heroes together, reaching an impressive conclusion that proves yes, it can work and it will be the coolest thing ever. Had the MCU ended here, this would have been quite a triumphant finale, but instead it reminded Hollywood that big risks are worth taking and wound up solidifying a trend. For that, the Avengers deserves respect. Number 3. Guardians of the Galaxy. Much like the Avengers, people were convinced that Guardians of the Galaxy was guaranteed to fail. How on earth could it succeed? Space movies had been failing and the characters were just so weird. I always figured this movie would surprise people, and I was right. People can say what they want about how the best comic book movies embrace realism. Me, though, I prefer adaptations that embrace the weirdness. Guardians of the Galaxy didn't just embrace the weirdness, it absorbed it into its very being. The one thing holding it back is the undeniable fact that not everyone in the movie wants to be there. If Glenn Close had chosen not to phone it in, or the studio had cast someone else, it might have been in the number 1 spot. Still, for an origin story to a crazy concept, you can't ask for better than this. Number 2. Iron Man. You just cannot deny that the first Iron Man is the best of the trilogy. Everything about it just works. The story works, the villain works, the acting works, the music works, the special effects work, everything works. It also has the distinction of being the only MCU movie that is allowed to stand entirely on its own until the post-credits stinger, something more of these movies should be allowed to do now that we know a shared universe exists. That is the primary reason why it ranks at number 2, so what could possibly top it? Number 1. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 currently beats them all. It embraces the weirdness of its concept without shame, it progresses the characters in meaningful ways, it has an excellent villain, the music is utilized to excellent effect, and it strikes just the right balance of action and emotion that keeps me hooked. Unlike its predecessor, the whole cast wants to be there and make the best movie possible, whether they are major players or unexpected cameos. Yeah, you just can't beat Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 in my book. Well, that's how I rank these things. As always, though, you're welcome to share your own rankings in the comments section below. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.